Okay, welcome back. Just a quick reminder that what we're trying to do here is get a brief overview of the Bible and see what all is in it. This is not an exhaustive, intensive examination of the various books or verses in the Bible, but just an overall look at the whole thing. And today, what we want to do is to look at how the Bible is arranged and how the books are grouped similarly. Now, it's important to point out, first of all, that they are not chronological. So you don't have everything in the Bible put in here chronologically along some kind of a timeline. Now, they are somewhat chronological, as you'll see in a few minutes, but they're not necessarily. They are arranged according to a system that made sense to the Jews, who of course did this with the Older Testament, and then somewhat the same arrangement was followed by Christians who did it with the Newer Testament. But keep in mind again that all of these Bible books were separate books, and that they all had to be grouped together into the Bible, gathered together, and that this gathering together of all of these different works took place over quite a long period of time. In the process, of course, some were tossed out, and people said, no, that one doesn't belong in here for whatever reason. And others people said, oh, this one definitely does belong, and I think it belongs in this group. So this was not a process that was handed down by God. It's a process that human beings undertook to try to make sense of it all and arrange it in some orderly way. So first of all, let's start with the Old Testament, and the first main section of the Old Testament in both the Jewish Bible, what we call the Old Testament, and in our Christian Bible, the older of the two Testaments, is usually referred to as the Pentateuch. Now, the Pentateuch comes from, you might recognize the part of this that means five, like a pentagram or the Pentagon, which is a five-sided building. So Pentateuch literally means five books. And these are the first five books of the Bible. The Jews usually refer to them as Torah, which quite literally means the divine instruction. So they see the first five books, the Pentateuch, as kind of a unique divine instruction that contains really, really, really pivotal, basic, important stuff. And these five books are generally acknowledged to have been written by Moses. There's dispute about that, of course. There's dispute about almost everything. But generally speaking, these books have a Mosaic origin. Genesis, the word Genesis comes from a Greek word that literally means beginning, and it is, of course, the book of beginning. It is the beginning of the world, it's the beginning of animal life and plant life, it's the beginning of human beings. It is also, unfortunately, the beginning of sin. It is the beginning of salvation. It's the beginning of marriage. It's the beginning of family. So it is aptly named Genesis, the book of beginnings. The next book, Exodus, comes from a Greek word that quite literally means exit. I was on a Greek airliner one time, and over every exit it had the word Exodus. And the main topic of the book of Exodus is, of course, the exodus of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, from their 400-plus year slavery in Egypt. And that exodus from Egypt to return to the land of Abraham, the land of Israel, was such a pivotal event that it marked all of Jewish history forever and ever. And the book of Exodus is about that event and the things surrounding it. Leviticus is mostly about the Levites or the priests. It's a priestly book, and it mostly has to do with the sanctuary, which was the precursor to the Jewish temple, and the priesthood, the sacrifices, the offerings, the holy days, the holy things, all the duties of the priests, and so on. The book of Numbers is called that because it numbers the people of Israel. And it tells how many tribes there were and who was the ancestor of all of those tribes. Oops, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. Got Jesus on the brain, which is not too bad. The people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham. And it numbers them and arranges them in their tribes. Deuteronomy, quite literally again, comes from the Greek, which means the second law. And not that there is a second, as in different law, but it's the second, the repetition of the law, the elaboration of the law. In the book of Exodus, in chapter 20, you have the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments and a lot of other stuff are repeated in Deuteronomy as the second giving or the second telling of the law. So in Deuteronomy, you have this elaboration of what was in one chapter in Exodus chapter 20. And that's the Pentateuch, or the Torah. You have to say that down deep in your throat so you sound like you're speaking Hebrew. Torah. Okay. Then comes a whole section of historical books. Joshua picks up the story right after Moses dies because Joshua is Moses' successor. He was Moses' lieutenant during the Exodus, and when Moses dies, Joshua takes over as the leader of the people of Israel. Then you have the book of Judges. Judges is about a period of time after Moses is dead, Joshua is dead, those early patriarchs are gone, and now Israel is ruled by a succession of people, mostly men, but a woman or two, who are called judges, which means not that they are the kind of judges that we're familiar with who sit in a courtroom, but the kind of judges who are like tribal leaders and who decide things and who lead the people and settle disputes and lead the people into war and those sorts of things. Then you have this interesting little book of Ruth, which is sort of a parenthesis put in there to explain about the ancestry of King David and ultimately Jesus, the Messiah. And it's just a sweet little story about a woman named Ruth and how she becomes part of the family. 1st and 2nd Samuel tells mostly the story of the prophet Samuel, who's also a judge and prophet. And Samuel is one of the greatest, maybe the greatest of all of the judges of Israel. And it's during his time that the people of Israel say, look, you're getting old, and after you will come your sons, and we're not really too keen on them because they're not very good. And so what we really want is a king. So would you please get us a king? And Samuel tries to talk them out of it and say, you don't really want a king. That's a bad idea all the way around. But they're insistent. They want a king. And so Samuel says, okay, I'll get you a king. And he anoints the first king of Israel, King Saul, S-A-U-L, not to be confused with the Saul in the New Testament who later becomes the Apostle Paul. King Saul is not a very good king. It's like he never really understands what it is to be the king of Israel, a representative of God. And so he doesn't last too terribly long, and then comes King David. And David is a great king. And David's story is told mostly in the book of Kings. And then you have the story of Chronicles, which goes on to tell more of the history of Israel at the end of the period of the kings. Saul, David, David's sons, Solomon, Solomon's sons, the rebellion against the house of David, the establishment of a parallel rival kingdom after a civil war, So there's actually two kings ruling over the territory, one over the tribes of Israel, the other over the tribes of Judah, and all of that mess, and how that eventually winds up with terrible things happening to Israel when the Assyrians invade their land and they are conquered and subdued and taken off into captivity. Then you've got these little stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, who are stories about Israel's experiences under captivity, and followed by this little story about Esther, who is one of the Jewish women who is born in captivity in Babylon, in Persia actually, but who becomes queen and is given an opportunity to do great good for her people, Israel. So this is the history pretty much from the death of Moses on into the period of the Babylonian captivity of Israel, which was around the 6th, 5th centuries BC. So this covers a period of time roughly around 1400 or so BC, maybe 1200 BC, we're not exactly sure, through the monarchy, the time of David, which is about 1000 BC, up to the Babylonian captivity around 600 BC, on into the time of the Persian captivity following that. Then the next major section of the Bible is what are called the major prophets, not because they're the most important, although I kind of think they are, but because they're the longest. The books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are very long books and authored by Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, who were prophets. Prophets were people that spoke to the people on behalf of God. Sometimes they said, this is what God wants, and sometimes they said, this is what God says. Listen, these are the very words that God spoke to me for you. So sometimes they're giving their understanding of what God is up to. Sometimes they are reciting words that God gave them to speak. All three of these guys had difficult lives. They were not welcomed, their words were not appreciated, and most of them suffered rather badly at the hands of their fellow Jews who didn't want to hear what they had to say because for the most part they were telling them that they weren't doing it right. Then comes the minor prophets, and again the minor prophets are not less important, it's just that their writings are a lot shorter. In some cases they're just a page or two in the Bible. And there's a bunch of these guys. You get a prize if you can name them all in order, but I don't get the prize because I can never remember them. But all of them telling experiences that they have had with God that are important for the people of Israel to learn lessons from. Enough said. Also in the Old Testament, you have a collection of what are referred to often as wisdom books. Interestingly enough, most of these are in poetic form, and some of them in very clear poetic form, some of them a little less familiar. Job, probably the oldest book in the entire Bible, probably predates the books of Moses. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know who Job was. It simply says that he was a man who was faithful to God, and it tells the story of things that happened to him and how he kept his faith in God in spite of all the terrible things that happened to him. So he's kind of a parable, or an allegory, I guess you could say, for all of us who follow God, who love God, who trust God, but who have terrible things happening in their lives. And it's an answer to that question, why do bad things happen even to good people? And it's revealed in the book that these bad things happen because there's an enemy in this world called Satan. Hebrew Satan means adversary, adversary of God. And because he's an adversary of God, he hates everything that God loves, which of course includes us. And so he does everything he can to make our lives miserable. And there are times when God prevents him from doing that to us, but other times when God allows it. I don't know exactly why. I suppose because God couldn't prevent it all the time, or that whole thing of free choice wouldn't be true for us. Anyway, Job's a great story. As I said, it's old, and so it's a little hard to understand, but it's very, very important to us. The book of Psalms are actually songs. That's what Psalms means, songs. And they're songs of worship, songs of praise, songs of penitence, songs of lament, most of them written by King David. Not all of them, there are a few others in there, but mostly these are David's compositions, and they are sometimes his inner thoughts, his inner musings. Sometimes they're his confessions of his sins. Sometimes he's singing out his love to God, those sorts of things. Proverbs, probably authored by David's son, Solomon, who became king after David, and who was said to be the wisest man who ever lived. And Proverbs are a collection of wise sayings designed to teach people, especially children, what is wise and right and true and good. Ecclesiastes, probably also authored by Solomon. The recurring theme in Ecclesiastes is vanity, and you hear him say over and over again, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. The word vanity actually means smoke or mist or something like that. And the idea is that everything that human beings pursue in this life is like a smoke, a mist, a fog. You try and grab it and it disappears. And it talks about the futility of trying to get money or trying to get reputation or trying to get power or trying to achieve beauty or whatever it might be, that all of this evaporates. And ultimately, of course, it's all lost because we all die. And so what really is the meaning of life? That's what Solomon's grappling with in Ecclesiastes. And the meaning of life is, as he wraps it up, to reverence God, to love him with all your heart, and to keep his commandments. That's what it's all about. And there's nothing else more important than that. Then we have the book of Song of Solomon, which again is probably also written by Solomon. And it's really a love story, an allegory about a young man and a beautiful young woman and their love for each other. But it's really an allegory about the relationship between God and his beloved, which is, of course, us. Okay, in the New Testament, we also have groupings. And the groupings also do, like they did in the Old Testament, group similar books together. And again, not chronologically, but according to similar subjects. First of all, we have the Gospels. The word gospel comes from a great Greek word which means the proclaiming of good news, the preaching of good news, the announcement of good news. So what we've got in the Gospels is the announcement of the good news that was brought to us by Jesus Christ. And these amount to stories about Jesus and his life, but as we pointed out in the last lesson, the focus is on the death and the resurrection of Jesus, because that's like the center of the good news. But the life of Jesus, the healings of Jesus, the miracles of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, this is all important as well, and it also is included in these 4 Gospels. The first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are usually grouped together and referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic is a word that means literally one eye, and that's because they all have a common viewpoint. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John kind of have the same point of view. They cover pretty much the same territory. They tell the same story with slight differences between them, but they are different than the book of John, which has a different kind of purpose and a different kind of point of view, which we'll look at in just a minute. Probably the first of these is Mark. I mean, the first one to be written, the earliest. And it was probably written well before the end of the first century. So I'll just put late first century. In other words, within 50 years or so of the time of Jesus, probably considerably within that time. Mark is the shortest of the three synoptic gospels, the shortest of all four of the gospels, and it moves very quickly, bam, 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 telling the incidents from the life of Christ. And the focus of this is all about, again, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, and an answer to the question, who is this guy? So frequently in the book of Mark, you have this kind of question being asked, who is this who calms the sea? Who is this who walks on the water? Who is this who heals the sick and raises the dead to life? Who is this guy? And the answer, of course, is this is Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, the Savior of the world. Probably Matthew and Luke both borrowed from Mark in writing what they wrote. Now, Matthew was one of the disciples of Jesus. We know him. He was a tax collector, and Jesus said, become one of my followers, and he did. And so he was one of the original apostles, the original 12, who were chosen by Jesus to be his students. That's the meaning of the word disciple, to be his students. And with the idea that when he was gone, they would pass all this information on. They would tell these stories. They would keep it going. And Matthew was one of those 12 guys. Levi Matthew, he's sometimes referred to. He was a Jew, of course, as they all were. A tax collector, so he was not very much loved by his fellow Jews, just like we don't love tax collectors very much, but they hated him even more than we did. We do. And Matthew writes a very comprehensive story about Jesus. He takes it back, interestingly enough, he takes it back to the beginning of Abraham. So he tells the story literally of Jesus' Jewishness, starting with Abraham and going up to the resurrection from the dead. Luke now was different. Luke was not an apostle. Luke was, as far as we can tell, a Gentile. That means to say he was not a Jew. He was a physician, probably spoke Greek as his primary language, not Hebrew or Aramaic like the Jews did. We're not exactly sure where he was from, probably what we would call Asia Minor today. Apparently, he was converted by the Apostle Paul and became a Christian, but had come out of a Greek philosophical pagan background. As a physician, he was learned, he was read, he wrote a very articulate, stylish Greek. If you study Greek and you read his book in the original Greek, you can tell the difference between his Greek and Matthew's Greek, for example. Now Luke, because he was not part of the original group, researched his book. This is not eyewitness testimony for him. For Matthew and for Mark, this is eyewitness stuff. And of course also for John. But for Luke, it's not eyewitness stuff. It's what you might call researched, or secondhand, or third-hand. In other words, just like we would research the story of Jesus, he had to research the story of Jesus. Of course, he had the advantage in that he was much closer to the actual events. And so he could talk to people who actually knew Jesus, who heard Jesus speak, who asked him questions, who were his students. And Luke tells us in the very beginning of his book, Luke chapter 1, that he carefully researched everything he could find. And he wrote this story about Jesus based upon his research. And now he is dedicating it to someone named Theophilus. The word Theophilus, the name Theophilus, was not uncommon in the Greek world. It literally means lover of God. And this lover of God may have been an individual named Theophilus, or it may simply be anybody who is a lover of God. Luke is addressing this book to you. And he takes the story of Jesus back, not to Abraham, like Matthew did, but all the way back to Adam, the father of all humanity. And I think, that's just another way of Luke saying, this is a bigger story than just a story for the Jews. This is a story for Gentiles too. This is a story for all of us. Luke's got a lot of great stuff, and because he's a doctor, it has a special emphasis on the healing miracles and the sicknesses that Jesus healed, which is kind of interesting. Okay, now we come to John. Now, John was one of the original disciples, one of the original 12. Peter and Andrew, his brother, and James and his brother John, those four were the core of the original 12 apostles. And John and his brother James, like their friends Peter and Andrew, were fishermen. And when Jesus came to them fishing by the Sea of Galilee and said, "Follow me and I will make you fishers of men," they did. And so they spent his entire ministry with him. Now keep in mind, Jesus' ministry only lasted 3.5 years. But James and John, Peter and Andrew, they were with him for that entire 3.5 years. They were with him at the cross. John specifically mentions that he was there when Jesus died, that Jesus said to John, "Take care of this, my mother." And he said to his mother, Mary, "You have a new son now. Here he is, John." So there was a very close relationship between Jesus and John. John even refers to himself in his book as the one that Jesus loved. Not that he didn't love the others, but he recognized that he and Jesus had a special kind of relationship. John writes his book fairly late, probably somewhere around 90 or so AD. Fortunately, unlike the other apostles, John was not murdered. He lived to a ripe old age. And when he wrote this book, Christianity had been established for almost half a century, about half a century, a little more than half a century. So now Christians, many of them were growing old. Some of them were dying. The other apostles were all gone. Only John was left. And I think he said, "Wow, I better write down some things here that the other apostles haven't written about." But he also had a different goal, because he was writing now not so that people would come to faith in Jesus Christ, but more he was writing to people who had come to faith in Jesus Christ, to help them to hang on, to endure the persecutions that were getting to come, to survive the questions that were being raised about theological stuff and the arguments back and forth that were going on, all the theological nitpicking that we still have with us today in the church. And so John's gospel is a little different. It's written more to Christians than it is to non-Christians. It's written more about insider stuff for insiders. And it's of great interest to us. And it is, as I said, an intimate look into relationship with Jesus. The next section of the New Testament has only one candidate, and that's the book of Acts of the Apostles. And the Acts of the Apostles are quite literally that. The book is a history of what the apostles did, a selected history, because all the stories are not told, simply some of the stories. In fact, at the end of the book, it specifically says it's not all here. It would take too many books to record it all. But it starts with the resurrection of Jesus and the angel saying to the apostles, "All right, Jesus has returned to heaven now. Now it's time for you guys to get busy." And they're saying, "What do we do?" And the angels say, "Jesus told you what to do. First of all, you start out by hanging out in Jerusalem until he gives you the power of the Holy Spirit. And then in the power of the Holy Spirit, you are to go into all the world, telling the whole world what you have seen and heard and what you know about Jesus. And they did just that. And literally thousands of people were converted and became followers of Jesus Christ. So that by the end of the first century, the Christian church was in many different countries with many different kinds of people speaking many different kinds of languages. By the middle of the 4th century, in the 300s AD, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. The Roman Emperor, Constantine, became a Christian and recommended Christianity to everybody. So from being a small sect of Judaism to being the major religion in the Roman Empire took only about 300 years, which is not much time in history. And it was largely due to the effective work of the apostles who took what they were told and spread it far and wide. This became the purpose for their lives. And in many cases, they offended so many people that it cost them their lives. At the beginning, Jews were somewhat favorable to the message about Jesus. But when they realized that it was either Judaism or Christianity, not both Judaism and Christianity, many Jews turned against it and recognized that Christianity was going to spell the end of Judaism for many Jews. And so they opposed it, persecuted it, arrested the apostles, put them in prison, got the Roman Empire to, in some cases, execute them or exile them, got rid of all of them. The very last of all the apostles was John, who died on the Isle of Patmos out in the Mediterranean Sea as an exile at the hand of the Roman government somewhere around 90 or 100 AD. That's the story of the Acts of the Apostles. That part's not told there because Acts of the Apostles ends with the story of the Apostle Paul and his work. Then you have the next major section in the New Testament, which is the epistles. Epistles, just another word for letters. That's what the epistles are. They are letters back and forth, but we only have the fourth. In other words, we have Paul's letter to the Romans. And these are arranged according to length. So the longest letter comes first. So Romans is the longest of all Paul's letters, so it appears first. It's not chronologically the first. Corinthians may have that honor. It was earlier than Romans for sure. And apparently there were letters back and forth between Paul and the Corinthians. We only have the two that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, or two that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, because there's evidence that he wrote at least 3 and maybe even 4. But we don't have 3rd and 4th Corinthians. We don't know what happened to them. And we don't have the letters that the Corinthians wrote to Paul. But we do have 2 of Paul's letters to the church in Corinth, which was, of course, a city in Greece. We have Paul's letter to the Galatians, Christians in Galatia. We have Paul's letter to the Ephesians, to the Philippians, to the Colossians. We have 2 letters he wrote to the believers in Thessalonica, again, a city in Greece. Now, and then we have 2 letters he wrote to his co-worker, Timothy. Timothy was a young man. He was kind of Paul's intern, I guess you might say. He was his helper, his traveling companion. And Paul wrote 2 letters, personal letters to Timothy, mostly encouraging him in his work in the ministry, encouraging him to carry on, even though Paul was in prison and couldn't be with him, to keep the faith, to stay faithful. We have a letter that Paul wrote to Titus, another one of his co-workers, and quite similar to the letters to Timothy in many ways. We have a letter he wrote to a guy named Philemon. Philemon was the owner of a slave who had become a Christian, probably converted by Paul, and the slave, whose name is Onesimus, was afraid to go back home to Philemon because he had run away, and the owner of a slave could do terrible things to a slave who'd run away. So Paul wrote a letter to Philemon, perhaps it was to be delivered by Onesimus, reminding Philemon that as a Christian, he has a duty to his slave that exceeds that of the law. Interesting little letter, very short, but interesting. Then we have the epistle to the Hebrews, and we don't know who wrote that. Traditionally, it was given to Paul, but I've read it in the original Greek, and it doesn't sound like Paul. I don't think it's Paul. It may be Timothy. It might be that Timothy wrote it. It might be, that another preacher named Apollos, who was quite eloquent and who, like Paul, traveled around preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ to Gentiles, and who was himself originally a Gentile before he was converted to Christ. It could be that it was written by Apollos. We don't know for sure, but I'm doubtful that it's Paul. If I had to make up a choice, I'd say probably Apollos, but it could have been Timothy. Yeah, we just don't know. But it's kind of a written sermon in many ways, and the theme of it is that Jesus is better than anything that anybody ever has or ever could offer to us. So don't trade Jesus for anything. You started out well, now hang in there. Don't let anybody discourage you. Don't even think about going back to Judaism. It doesn't compare. Judaism is all about preparation for Jesus. So don't think about going back to it. We'll talk more about that later on. Then we have what are sometimes referred to as the general epistles. Sometimes people refer to them even as the Catholic epistles, meaning not Roman Catholic like Roman Catholic Church, but Catholic meaning universal or general. And these are one letter by James. Now, this is apparently the James who was a brother to Jesus and who initially opposed Jesus, but eventually became a Christian. Then we've got two by Peter, and this, of course, is the Simon Peter that was an early apostle of Jesus, along with his brother Andrew and his friends, James and John. Then we've got three letters by John, who also wrote the Gospel of John. This is the John who was one of the early apostles of Jesus and who lived longer than any of the other apostles. And then we've got an epistle from Jude. Don't know very much about Jude, but it appears that he was the brother of James the Just, and that would make him also a brother of Jesus. Interestingly enough, just as an aside, Jesus was not an only child. It is said that he had brothers and sisters. I'm guessing that they were all younger than he, since Mary was pregnant with Jesus when Joseph and she married. So I'm guessing that there were a bunch of other children that came afterwards. Or it's possible that Joseph was a widower and he had children by a previous marriage, which would make them Jesus' half-brothers and half-sisters. We don't know, but there's no reason to believe that Mary didn't go on to have other children. She was quite young when she and Joseph married, so she could well have had quite a number of other children besides Jesus. Anyway, Jude is a short, interesting little book. Won't say any more about it here. Then we have one book that stands in a category all by itself in the New Testament, and that is, of course, the book of Revelation. The actual title of the book is the Apocalypse. And be careful here, because apocalypse doesn't mean what most people mean when they use the word apocalypse or apocalyptic. It literally means revealing, which is why the book is sometimes called the book of Revelation. It can also mean unveiling or showing. So the apocalypse of literally Jesus, which he gave to the apostle John. So the full title of the book is The Revelation of Jesus Christ, which he gave to his servant John. You can see why it gets shortened just to Revelation or Apocalypse, both of which mean exactly the same thing. When something's called apocalyptic, it's because it refers to the kinds of things that are told about in the book of Revelation, not because of the literal meaning of the word. Anyway, the book of Revelation is about the future, and it is the one book in the New Testament that is just filled with symbols and metaphors and dreams and visions and all kinds of things, most of which are very obscure and therefore very hard to interpret, which of course gives interpreters a field day because they can do all kinds of crazy things with the book of Revelation, and they have. So the book of Revelation has been made to say many, many, many things, not all of which can possibly be true because they conflict with each other. But one thing is clear. The clear truth of the book of Revelation is that things are going to get bad, but Jesus is going to bring his people through. So it's a book about hope. It's a book about courage. It's a book that says they're going to do their best to destroy you, but Jesus is strong enough to bring you through, so hang in there. And this was written, again, by John, who also wrote a gospel and 3 epistles. And he was, of course, one of the early disciples of Jesus. And he was also, of course, the longest lived of all the apostles of Jesus, who died in exile somewhere around the turn of the 1st century. And John was already seeing the signs of terrible things happening to Christians in the Roman Empire. There were persecutions, and John knew that it was going to be hard for Christians to hang on. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why he wanted to communicate these visions and dreams that Jesus had given him about what would take place in the future. The revelation is the revealing of the future, the revealing of what will take place. And there's a lot of good stuff in there, but here's the important point. We win. Which is to say, Jesus wins. And so those who are on his side win right along with him. So there's nothing to be really afraid of, no matter how bad it gets. So that kind of set up. And now let me just say a word about something else, because sometimes if you buy a Bible, particularly a Catholic Bible, a Roman Catholic Bible, you will find other things in it besides the books that I have mentioned here. These books belong to what are often called the Apocrypha, a word that means hidden, or the Pseudepigrapha, a word that means false writings. There are many manuscripts floating around out there in the archaeological museums that claim to be inspiration or revelations. They are, some of them claiming to be stories about Jesus. The only trouble is that the author is unknown, and the first time that this ever showed up was in the 3rd century BC, when all the apostles who possibly could have known Jesus personally are dead. So it's obviously a forgery. It claims to be, in one instance, the gospel according to Thomas, or the gospel according to Judas in another instance. But clearly it's not. Clearly they are forgeries. Somebody authored this stuff long after the time of Jesus, long after the time of the apostles, and pretended that they were writing as the Apostle Thomas, doubting Thomas, or the Apostle Judas, who betrayed Jesus. But they weren't. They were forgeries. And so they did not deserve to be collected into the Bible, and they weren't. In other cases, there were things that were really pretty good. I mean, they were well written, and they were truthful, and there's valuable stuff in there, but they don't have the same authority as the things that were written by apostles or close associates of the apostles. And so they were left out of the Bible, not because they were false, but just because they didn't have the same characteristics, the same authority that the ones that were included in the Bible have. So you have quite a mass of stuff. Let me illustrate it like this. All these different writings, some of them claim to be apostolic, some of them claim to be authentic, but they're not all. And so it was necessary for early Christians to go through this huge pile of stuff and sort it out and decide, okay, this one's not, this one's not, this one's not, this one's not, oh, this one is, and this one is, and this one is, but this one's not, and this one's not. And so to collect out of this massive writing the ones that were considered to be true, authoritative, that is to say, inspired, and worth including in the Bible. In this particular case, of course, the New Testament. But the same thing had to be done for the Old Testament, but it was done a whole lot earlier, and it was done by the Jews long before the time of Christ. So in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, you have a process whereby a canon, not the kind that shoots cannonballs, but a canon, C-A-N-O-N, without two N's, and the canon is what gives us the Bible. I mean by that the biblical canon is the authorized, collected, proven works, excluding the ones that are questionable or forgeries or just not of the same quality. So this process of canonization that produced the biblical canon was done by Jews for the Old Testament and by Christians for the New Testament. And now what we have, of course, is the Christian Bible. Here's a graphic I found that might be helpful. And you can see the divisions here. Obviously the two great divisions, the Old Testament and the New Testament, or as I like to call it, the Older Testament and the Newer Testament. And in the Older Testament, you have the law, you have history books, you have poetry, you have the major prophets, you have the minor prophets. In the New Testament, you have the Gospels, book of church history, the letters, many of them, and then the book of prophecy, which is the book of Revelation. So I'll let you figure out how you can clip that out if you want to, save it as an image, because I think it's a nice graphical representation of what we've been talking about here. Well, this got a little bit longer than I had intended it to, covered more ground than I intended to cover. Of course, I always seem to do that, but hope it's been helpful to you.